Alright, so, just make sure this is properly broadcasting. It's supposed to. I know. Oh, yeah. Cool. Alright. So, first order of business, I guess just as a reminder for the online section, uh, since you're not physically in class, I'm going to put the discussion days thing up on Blackboard each week that we have a full week, so I'll be putting one up today. Just make sure you answer that before next week, next Wednesday, which next week's going to be a short week, so we won't have a discussion day next week. Yeah, that's your attendance for online. Speaking of next week, we're not going to be here Monday, so when you don't see a video Monday, that's because we didn't have one. So that's that. Any questions? You good? Okay. All right. Let's get into Mesopotamia. Because we got to get into the big major civilizations, and Mesopotamia is definitely one of the first. So, something we're going to see a lot of, and I mean well into, honestly, the modern day, is that big cities, well, I mean, Mesopotamia initially, a couple of big cities, human settlements were defined by geography. Where's a good place to settle? Typically not out in the middle of the desert. Mesopotamia, in particular, is settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates would flood, and then the land left behind would be very, very rich and fertile for farming. So it was a good place to farm. However, it wasn't a good place to set up an individual farm because dealing with flooding every year was a lot of work. So these early cities may have started as farming communities where people would come together and irrigate fields to take advantage of the flooding and avoid the negative consequences. So we have a lot of cities throughout Mesopotamia. Again, they were essentially little city-states. There was no there would eventually be a sort of a Mesopotamian empire, but Mesopotamia, as we're speaking of right now, is more of a region than like a specific kingdom. So there are lots of little cities, little city-states, one of which was Sumer. We're going to speak of a few more here before the end. I mean, there's a map here in the book. Nineveh, Assur, Sippar, Babylon, Kish, Nippur, Shuruppak, Uruk, Eridu, Sumer, I guess, was the biggest one. Yeah, so, Now, what's important for us historically is they had writing. Now, interestingly enough, the oldest examples we have of writing in Babylonia, not Babylonia, Babylonia was one of the cities, in Mesopotamia, were basically sales receipts. They were clay tablets with numbers on them. They were transactions for sales. So the oldest form of human writing that we currently have access to, maybe one day we'll find something older, but they were numbers that were used on tablets as, again, basically records of economic transactions. So there you go, sales figures. So early writing were pictographs. They would, if you wanted to talk about an ox, you drew a little ox head. If you were talking about a person, you would draw a little person. Eventually, these would evolve to represent sounds. Very gradual. I think I've got a. I mean, there's a thing in the book on how these evolved over time. I might have a picture of this. I don't remember. I know I've got a picture of cuneiform. Speaking of which, it was called cuneiform, which takes its name after the cuneus or wedge, which is the tool that was used to do the writing. Because again, the writing was on a bit of wet clay using this wedge-shaped stylus, where they would mark in the clay, and then they would fire it and make it essentially rock. And you have a pretty long-lasting record. Which also means that if there were records written on things that were not as permanent as these clay tablets, we don't know, because they no longer exist. Because again, like paper don't last real long. So yeah, this showed up around 3000 BCE and was the main form of writing in Mesopotamia for about 2,000 years, which is pretty significant considering how much the English language has changed just in the last 500. Now, as is often the case, something that is very important in transcribing history and law and language and all of that soon became specialized for scribes and priests and the upper class, and was typically kept out of the hands of the lower class. So you very rarely, if ever, would find cuneiform tablets of like commoners. You very much would not find like a diary of what Joe the farmer did today. These were only used by the upper class. Again, in the book, if you manage to get your hands on it, page 15 has this thing on cracking cuneiform, where this guy 19th century British adventurer perched himself precariously on the mountainside to copy the inscription and hired an agile local boy to make plaster casts of the parts he could not reach. Took him 10 years to make a complete copy, and was not long afterward he was able to decode and translate the Babylonian cuneiform. He never explained how he had managed to crack one of the world's most complex scripts. He was a gifted linguist and knew many relevant old languages, yada, yada, yada. But he never explained how he was able to do it, which is kind of frustrating, because he could have been making it up. But based on what he has said, it tracks with the translations we've done, so I guess it wasn't complete crap. And again, writing's important because people can record history and events more concretely than simply oral traditions, because obviously if you tell a story and have someone else repeat it and then have someone else repeat that and et cetera, it's going to change over time, especially if this story is your history over hundreds, if not thousands of years. Having it written down, I wouldn't say avoids that, because boy howdy, we've had even relatively recent history get screwed up, but it at least has a solid record of what the history is. But also, people could think critically. They could have the info in front of them and then think about it in comparison to something else, as opposed to just it all being in their head. So again, writing, super important to the advancement of civilization. And if you want to know what cuneiform looks like, there it is. I would not be able to read that. It is a very intense ancient language, for sure. I feel bad that I put this all together before I knew about Ibn Sir. Otherwise, I would have that up here. Because one of the earliest examples we have is, I was going to say someone, but a lot of people complaining about a shady copper merchant named Ibn Sir. And he's an internet meme now. And the fact that, like, some shady copper merchant who would sell people low-quality copper, like 3,000 plus years, well, now at this point it'd be, 5,000-6,000 years ago? The fact that this guy is, like, known all over the world again is, it's a testament to the written language, the written word, and its power. Why are you doing this to me, Discord? It doesn't matter. I'll figure that out later. So, a couple of terms here. The priests were more or less the king. They were the ones in charge. Kings, nobles, and priests are the ones who had power. The soldiers, artisans, and farmers are the ones who produced for the city. The soldiers fought, and the artisans made stuff, and the farmers grew stuff. It's your basic city. And then, of course, they had slaves that did all the labor that nobody else wanted to do. So, above the priests, because again, the priests were in charge of the city, but above that were known as lords, or in the Mesopotamian, Lugals, who were the closest to what we would think of as an actual king, because they were not only in charge of their city, but many other cities under them. So this was not just like a guy running a city, but he had influence over many others through either warfare or like economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, whatever. Speaking of which, the cities were always fighting each other. Again, Mesopotamia was not a single structure of an empire. It was a bunch of little cities that did their own thing, and doing their own thing is often fighting each other. The closest we had to a single empire was the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great, who united much of Mesopotamia under his rule. Which is to say, under the point of a sword. So here we have the Akkadian Empire here, Elam, which was, I guess, a part of that staged a revolt. And then up here, the Hurrian kingdoms. I mean, and again, you can even see here on the map, we're not even entirely sure the names of some of these cities because they are just so old that the records are kind of hard to make out. And then south of this was just a bunch of nomadic folks that weren't really involved. So, Ur-Nammu. This is where the ziggurat of Ur was built, hence the name. And this was the first law code in history that we, again, have records for. But basically, if you did a crime, you had to pay a fine. For the most part. Now, some things, more egregious crimes have more harsh punishments, but for the most part, crimes were solved by payments. By comparison, we have King Hammurabi in Babylon, who had the Code of Hammurabi, which is another law code, which were court proceedings, which, again, is not that different from the modern day. At least that's how it's supposed to work, where if there's a case that has never quite been seen before, however that court proceeding goes, not necessarily is the new law, but it's now the new precedent, and how any future court cases that are similar will be looked at. In this case, if there was some kind of conflict, whatever that court case decided would now become the new law. So any other conflict later on that was the same way, they wouldn't even bother with a court. You just say, okay, well, this is what the law is. So. And also, the Code of Hammurabi was a lot more, let's see, yeah, a lot more harsh. Capital punishment was prescribed for a host of offenses, including adultery, robbery, incest, and kidnapping. If a matter could not be resolved from the evidence provided by witnesses, the accused was subjected to a trial by ordeal or divine judgment, tossed into a river if the guilty sank, the innocent were able to swim to shore, etc., etc. Also, there were sharp legal distinctions between the upper and lower class. So if a peasant harmed a noble, you were going to get your hand cut off. If a noble harmed a peasant, he might have to pay a fine. Or not anything. Completely unlike today. So, the religion of Mesopotamia was largely polytheistic. Since the survival of the region relied on agricultural prosperity, and agriculture relies on the pretty consistent yearly flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, um, there's not much you can do about the yearly flooding, but hope that whatever sky beings make it rain are going to be nice to you that year. So there are all sorts of different deities that had to do with the rain and the water and the rivers and the sun. So the priests were important because they were the ones who spoke to the gods. Simple enough. I mean, this is something we're actually going to see once we get to the Middle Ages. The clergy were considered more important than the knights, even though the knights were the ones defending the people. The clergy were the ones who were like praying for their souls. So things don't change that much. So, in fact, priests became so important that kings started taking over priestly functions to further their own importance. They basically started taking the priest's jobs in order to also bolster their own importance. Which, again, we see much later in history with, like, when England separates from the Catholic Church, in case the Anglican Church, the king is essentially the head of the church now. So you don't have the Pope anymore, you've got the king, who is now the head of the state and the head of the church. But that's not going to be until like next semester. So anyway, here is a ziggurat. I believe this one has been rebuilt. I don't think it was in that good of a shape before. But this is out in the desert. This is what they look like. Again, essentially pyramidal structure. A little more boxy, but same idea. Again, wider base, smaller top, just is structurally sound. Plus, that's high, it's much easier to get up there when you do that with like a stairway, I should say. All right. Well, I don't really have any way to introduce this. So, Egypt. This is very important. Lots of stuff. It's been around forever. It showed up a few hundred years after Mesopotamia. Once again, it depended on the Nile River and thus the agriculture that the Nile River created, because again, the river would flood yearly, and then when the waters would recede, it would leave lots of nice fertile land behind, and it was really good for growing food. And it literally made Egypt not just livable, but prosperous. It was also more stable than Mesopotamia because while it did have that prosperous river, everything around it was desert. You were either on the Nile or you were in the desert. The area around the Nile was green, but then you got any further and it was just wasteland. So there wasn't a lot of like people around to come in and try to take your stuff. So there wasn't a lot of invasion. Again, relied on the Nile seasonal floods. I already talked about that. There were two regions of Egypt initially, upper and lower. Now, when you look at a map, Lower Egypt is to the north because, well, they didn't care about modern maps. It's called Lower Egypt because it's the lower part of the Nile River. That's where the delta is. That's where the river empties out into the Mediterranean. So Upper Egypt is the upper part of the river to the south. Um, and they were separate until about 3000 BCE. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Um, it was very rich. They had lots of stone, minerals, clay, shiny rocks, precious stones, gems, whatnot. Ugh, talking 2 classes in a row gets my throat sore. And they would trade this stuff for hardwood because, again, living in the desert, you don't really have access to much tree life. They had some trees, but they weren't hardwood. You get palm trees and that sort of thing, but that sort of wood's not really good for building. So they would trade their various riches to other areas that had, like we have, pine trees or cedar trees or oak or whatever, the big, thick, heavy trees. Of course, Egyptian writing, hieroglyphics, which is called sacred writing. It emerged around 3100 BC. Pictographs, phonograms, ideograms. So it was a mix of not just like pictures of what they were trying to depict, but also like the images that were meant to represent sound, also images that were meant to represent ideas. It was complicated. I mean, it still is complicated, but hieroglyphs are a whole thing. And as I kind of alluded to with Mesopotamia, while most of what we have with hieroglyphics are like carved into literal rock, they did have papyrus. They did have paper, papyrus made out of reeds, and they had lots of reeds because, again, the Nile River. So they had a form of paper they could use for more mundane writing, stuff that was just, personal communication or writing about, like, events that were going on, stuff that's more mundane than herein lies entombed the great god, king, emperor, so-and-so, that you carve on a wall. That said, we didn't know what the hell any of this said until Napoleon's soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone in the 1800s. Early 1800s. And we'll actually get into what the Rosetta Stone was a little bit later when it was actually created, because the Rosetta Stone wasn't created at this time. So here's Egypt, which, this is mostly, Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is everything this way. But this is where most of, when we think about Egypt stuff takes place. When the delta spreads out into the Nile, so you've got all this rich land, all this good stuff. Memphis was the capital for a long time. That's where most of the majority of the mummies were prepared. And then, of course, Giza, Cairo. Where's the other one? Was there another one that I knew? Well, of course, there's Rosetta and Alexandria eventually, but we'll get to that later as well. I don't know why Naucratis is like in bold and red. I don't know what Naucratis is. There's just some hieroglyphs. I'm sure we've all seen hieroglyphs. It's, again, well beyond my ken. I can pretend to read like German. That's about as far as I'm going to get. So, here we go. Narmer united the Upper and Lower Kingdoms in about 3000 BCE, which began the early dynastic period. So this was very early on in Egyptian history. This was, well, again, the two sections of Egypt were now united. Eventually we had the Old Kingdom, which was half a millennium of stability. 500 years of things going pretty well. And considering more modern countries, that's pretty damn good. This is when the rulers were regarded as gods. This is what we think of when we think of, like, Egypt. Is like, oh yeah, the pharaohs were seen as gods. Pharaohs is not what they were called. They were emperors. And them being regarded as gods was only really in the Old Kingdom. This is also when the pyramids were being constructed. Couple of things. I mentioned this in my American history class because we were talking about this. But when the construction of the pyramids started, there were still some mammoths left in the world. I think it was mostly Siberia, because there weren't that many people up there hunting them. But there were still some mammoths that had not gone extinct yet when this started. That said, the pyramids were really freaking expensive, really, really labor intensive, and may well have weakened the Old Kingdom. Oh, okay. And weakened the Old Kingdom's stability. Should also mention, oh man, there's so much weird shit when it comes to time. Alright, so pyramids were being built at the same time that we still have some mammoths. Cleopatra is closer to the modern day than she was to when the pyramids were being built, because that was so long ago that she's like closer to us in time. Also, the T-Rex was closer in time to the pyramids being built than the T-Rex was to when the Stegosaurus existed. Because the Stegosaurus existed like 135 million years ago, and then they died out, and the T-Rex was about 65 million years ago when the asteroid hit. That's significantly longer than from the 65 million to when the pyramids happened. So the dinosaurs existed for way longer than they haven't existed. Just to put how much of a tiny time frame we are on as humans. So the Old Kingdom fell in 2124 BCE, which led to the Middle Kingdom. Royal power was considered weaker. Anyone who had the money could go to the other world, not just royalty, which led to a lot of crypts throughout Egypt. This led to, nobles and any commoners who had the money were mummified, and this led to Osiris, who was seen as the divine mummy of the Egyptian pantheon. he rose in prominence due to really his lore, and that he was sort of this patron god of, like, anyone could be resurrected as a divine being. In 1730 BCE, the Semitic Hyksos, a group of nomadic raiders with horses and chariots, rolled in, invaded Egypt, but never really ruled it. They just sort of stuck around for like 150 years, and then were eventually driven out. So that was kind of a pain. The Egyptians didn't quite have chariot technology yet. And, like, at this time, a chariot was basically a board between two wheels attached to a horse. Like, it wasn't the Roman chariot you think of, this almost like a couch. But it's a platform you can stand on and have like a spear to throw at your enemies. So it's really helpful in warfare. Let me respond to. Yes, Lord, do my parents not communicate? My mom tells me that they're paving the road in her neighborhood. All well and good. And then my dad sends me the same message. Anyway. So there is, like, the Great Pyramid in Giza, the Sphinx as well, which we'll discuss that a little bit more later. Because there's, all kinds of mystery behind why it was built and what its purpose was. And, like, the fact that the head isn't the right size compared to the body, and it was probably, like, carved down into the head of one of the rulers later on, because they would do that sort of crap. Like, if there was a ruler in the past that they hated, they would just have the sculptors just, like, carve their face into the old statue, even though it would mean that their head was small on the statue's body. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Here's Osiris. If you're not familiar, quick cliff notes on Osiris. He was, I don't remember exactly what he was before the mummification thing happened. But he got on the bad side of, I want to say, Set. And Set's not the one you want to get on the bad side of. He cut Osiris into many, many bits and flung him all over Egypt. And his sister wife went around and collected his pieces and sewed him back together. Except for a rather important piece of his that landed in the Nile, and Sebek ate it. Sebek being the crocodile god. So we'll just say they never had kids. Yeah, Egyptian mythology is crazy. So, yeah, that's Osiris. All right, into the New Kingdom. Because again, there's a lot going on. Amenhotep. He decided that, hey, so, we've got all these gods, they've got all this really cool mythology and stuff. Well, we're just going to go to one god. We're going to be monotheistic. And everybody flipped out. They lost tributaries, which is to say, other nations that were not directly under Egyptian control, but were basically under their jurisdiction, and would send them tribute, just like send them gold and stuff to just leave them alone. Um, we're like, well, if this guy was going to turn this back on the gods, we're not going to have any part of this. And it was pretty much pandemonium. By the 1250s, order was restored under military rulers like Ramses II, who something cursed slab. So as I mentioned, Egyptians tended to be polytheistic. There's a lot of really weird and crazy gods. I like to compare them to the Greeks and the Norse when it comes to their gods. There's a lot of them, and they're petty, they're vindictive, but they're very interesting. At least with the Egyptian gods, though, they typically weren't like, hey, let's go pick on the humans. They were mostly messing with each other, to my memory, for the most part. Like, as long as you didn't specifically piss off one of these gods, they wouldn't specifically mess with, like, the pathetic little humans. Whereas the Greek gods were just like, let's kick over this anthill and see what happens. Because the Greek gods were assholes. The main god was, of course, Ra, the sun god, because, well, the sun's important. I mean, it's important in, like, every culture because it's where the light comes from. It's where the heat comes from. It's what makes the plants grow. I mean, even if, obviously, it wasn't until much later that, like, people understood that the sunlight makes the plants grow. But if you have a plant in the sun and you have a plant, like, in the shade of a tree, the plant in the sun's going to grow better. Like, that's just something they can observe. They don't need to know how chlorophyll works, how photosynthesis works. That's just, hey, the thing in the sun is growing better than the thing that's not in the sun. Why? Sunlight good. Typically, rulers were seen as divine to some degree, and had some control over the Nile. Now, this was both good and bad. Obviously, it was good because, well, you had ultimate authority. You could tell your people, they had to listen to you, or you would make it not flood, and therefore they'd have no harvest, and they would all starve. But this also meant, who would the people blame if the river didn't flood and their harvest went bad? Who were the people? Exactly. So, like, you get all the praise for when the weather's good, but when the weather's bad, it's your fault. And the book doesn't go into too much detail, but I think a few leaders got kicked out and relieved of. What's that? The French treatment. Yes, they were relieved of their position and their heads because they didn't do a good job. There were a few female rulers. Hatshepsut is one such ruler. She's shown in the book on page 24. Again, if you can't get your hands on the book, whatever. But in one depiction, she even has like the long, like conical, conical, not canonical, conical beard. That's often depicted for the rulers. But that was very rarely real. Like, that was just like ornamental anyway. So the female ruler with the little like stuck on beard thing is just like, it's the same as her wearing the big pharaoh hat. It's just like, yeah, that's just part of the get up. Page 25 also has Egypt as seen from outside, because again we had like papyrus and people were able to write about stuff beyond just the great divine whatever is going on that is going to be carved into rock. Some people were talking about how like great and powerful Egypt was. Some people were complaining about like the unfair taxes, just general people existing stuff. Very little has changed. Speaking of Ra, if you get it, this movie is much older than anybody in this class now. Anyway, there's Ra, the sun god. The idea was that he was riding across the sky on his chariot and was pulling the sun with him. Because, I mean, how else are you going to explain a big-ass fireball going across the sky every night? Why not a god in his chariot? There's Hatshepsut. Alright. I think we might be able to maybe finish this chapter today. Alright. So, iron replaced bronze for weapons and tools, which, Iron Age, which again, as we mentioned last time, was not a universal thing. It's not like one group gets iron and everyone is immediately upgraded to iron. Each group has to gradually adopt and learn how to mine and work iron themselves. So some groups are going to be ahead of others. So there's the Minoans. We don't know much about them because we don't have much history on them. There's not much writing that survives. They were on the island of Crete. They were a major center of Mediterranean trade. We know that much from just artifacts that were scattered around the Mediterranean from this time period that were Minoan in origin. They depicted bulls in their art. I'll show that in a minute. Why would we even mention that? Well, because it was really prominent. They used a linear A-B writing, which is like a really super early Proto-Greek writing, kind of. And then between 1400 and 1350, they just kind of disappeared. We don't know if it was we don't think it was an invasion because based on the archaeological evidence, there's very little indication of an armed invasion and struggle, and because that sort of stuff leaves behind evidence. And there is these guys, the Mycenaean Greeks, invaded Crete at one point, invaded Crete, and the Minoans were gone. They were like, what the hell? Where's our fight? We don't know if there was a volcano that erupted and it caused them to evacuate, or what happened, but they just kind of disappeared. So the Mycenaean Greeks had heavily fortified settlements. They fought all the time with each other, with everybody else. They had, do I have this here? Yeah. They were influenced by Minoan writing. Like I said, the later Greek writing is influenced by linear A-B. They invaded and took over Crete, but again, there's no evidence of an actual fight. They showed up in Crete and the Minoans were already gone. And just, I don't know, man. If I showed up on an island and everybody was gone, I wouldn't want to stay there. I feel like there's a reason ain't nobody here, guys. maybe we can grab some of their stuff, but I want to leave. Here's some of Minoan art. It was like bull vaulting, where they would stand and have the bull charge them and then like leap over the bull. So here's some of the ancient Mycenaean Greek structures. We only really have some evidence of this because most of the later Greek cities, the ones we're used to talking about, were built on top of these. So like when we see the ruins of ancient Greece, they're on top of these ruins. So it's very difficult to look at this stuff without messing up the stuff that's already on top of it. Oh yeah, we'll knock this out. I've only got 2 more slides. Mycenaeans, so a little bit more of, a little bit more of the Greeks. They did not have agriculture. They either traded for what they needed or took it through warfare. Which, speaking of RimWorld, sounds like how my friend is currently playing it. Just murders everybody. She's also playing a crew of cannibals, so like every person she kills just like goes in the fridge, food for later. So yeah, it works. Yeah. And then like every time there's one of those like, we need you to take care of this like manhunter herd, and it's like 80 something rhinoceros. It's like, well, fill up the fridge, I guess. So yeah. Well, what she's been doing is been building a defense maze around a thermal geyser. So she's doing the opposite. So they go in, and then she turns on the vacuum doors, so it locks in all that heat. And by the time they get to the end, they're either dead or on fire. Very fun. So yes, that but in reverse. Speaking of which, speaking of brutal combat, this was when the Trojan War happened. We have very little contemporary writing about the Trojan War, which is to say, the people that were fighting in the Trojan War didn't write about it much, or most of it was destroyed. What we know about the Trojan War is largely from Homer's Iliad, which is the story of Troy, which happened around 1200 BCE. And I say that because this was something I didn't know, because I always was taught, the Trojan War happened, and that's what the Iliad was about. That's kind of in reverse as far as how historians found out about it. We knew about, Homer's Odyssey, this magical trip about this dude who fought all sorts of crazy crap. And then the Trojan War, or the Iliad, the Trojan War. But we had no evidence that the Trojan War had happened. We had no other writings. We didn't even know that there was a city where this place supposedly existed. So eventually there was a German archaeologist who was just like, screw it, I'm going to go roughly where he said the city of Troy existed, and I'm going to start digging around. And he found Troy. And it was laid out in the way that Homer described it in the Iliad. So, like the Trojan horse, and obviously all the drama and stuff, we don't know how much of that was true, but like most of what we know about the Trojan War is because of Homer, who was telling a story of a thing that happened, because we have very few records from this time period. The Hittites, they made their way into the region around 2000 BCE, and they were the first ones who had iron weapons, which helped them out a lot. It took about 1,000 years before everybody else had caught up to that technology. And when you've got 1,000-year advantage on everybody else, you're going to be the scary ones in town. And then, and for some reason, well, I say for some reason, because I teach this class, I ended up on some stupid Facebook group. It's literally called "We Pretend It's the Bronze Age," and they have two jokes. One of them, E. Nasir. I was sold poor quality copper, yada yada. And the other is the Sea People. The Sea People, we don't know who they were, where they came from, or where they went, but there were people, presumably from the sea, on boats, I guess, that showed up and wrecked everything. They caused basically every empire we've talked about so far to collapse, or at least weaken significantly. They were probably bandits and raiders and malcontents from every one of these different groups that were just out pillaging and burning and causing trouble, and were not a single unified whole. But as far as these other groups were aware, they were just people that came out of nowhere. Finally, we have the Phoenicians, known as the Purple People, due to a dye that they traded, made from sea snails. Purple is important because why is purple important for dye? Exactly. Yeah. Purple was the color of royalty, and it made a lot of money. Also, it was really hard to make. So the fact that they were making a lot of this stuff meant that they were making all of the money. Also, the Phoenicians basically controlled all the trade in the Mediterranean at the time. Also, they adapted a Semitic alphabet, which is very important for the creation of an eventual Latin language. And their alphabet has letters for sounds, which I know is like, okay, well, duh, what they had before? Before it was like symbols for sounds, and like symbols for words and symbols for meanings, and like it was very contextual. Whereas with this, a letter was a letter, like what we're currently looking at on the board. Now, they only had consonants, so it was still a little bit weird. There was still like a lot of contextual understanding to what you were looking at. But it was a step forward. And this is literally where you get phonics from. You know, oh, you sound something out phonetically, literally from the Phoenicians. Literally their type of language. But I mean, and again, it's like, oh, how would people know how a language was written if it had to do with context? Well, the English language. How do you spell read? Exactly. Well, which one was I talking about? Who knows? I just said read. But if I said it in a sentence, then you know what I was talking about. Or again, how do you spell red? Or or R-E-A-D. So, again, what does R-E-A-D spell? Read or read. So, yeah, like, there's so much of that just in English. Now, granted, English is a bit of a bastardized language, so we've got a lot of those. But there's a lot of that in other languages, too. So the point is, context matters in language forever. It just used to be really bad. Pretty sure this isn't what the Trojan horse looked like. That's a lot of work. I think I've got another one a little bit later. But, the idea of Trojan horse, they bring it into the city, it's full of dudes. There's the empires, the Egyptian Empire under Ramses II, the Hittite Empire up here. So the Hittite Empire is big. And then the Phoenicia here, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Tyre ended up founding Carthage. And then these regions get overrun, and Carthage becomes its own thing. There is the shell of the sea snail that makes the purple dye. You can tell. It's very purple. It looks... What's that? Oh, yeah. It looks poisonous. I wouldn't want to get my hands on that. All right, one more slide and then we're done. The Hebrews. They've stuck around to the modern day as a present-day culture, due in large part to their binding religion and tradition of oppression, because boy howdy, they've had a hard time of it. Monotheism eventually. I'll get to that in just a minute. Should we talk about henotheism? We'll see in just a second. One of the main fathers of the religion is Abraham, father of many, departed Ur, which began the Hebrews. Oh yeah, here we go. So initially, Judaism was henotheistic, which meant that they did recognize multiple gods, but had a single God above the others. So Yahweh was their chief god, and the others were seen as lesser gods and eventually were pushed out entirely, which then made the religion monotheistic. Because apparently the pantheon that Yahweh belongs to is actually a Canaanite pantheon, and Yahweh was the god of like metallurgy or something. The Hebrews just like latched onto that and made it their own and changed the rules as they saw fit, because that's what you do with ideas. You just do what you want with them. 400 years of captivity to receive Mesopotamia. We of course had Moses, led the Jews out of Egypt. However, because he like hit a rock twice or something, the Old Testament's very very unfair. He died before they made it to Canaan, so Joshua invaded Canaan. There's a lot of different tribes, politically diverse. They fought each other all the damn time. I tell you, the Old Testament would be a lot shorter if the Hebrews could just get out of their own damn way. They're just constantly fighting each other. So yeah, there's out of Egypt, and then here out of Ur, actually into this region here. And yeah, that's it. And being 11:10, we're not going to start the next chapter. That said, we do have Monday off. I said that at the start of class. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Oh.